Welcome once again to the Tin Dog Podcast. This episode will be being broadcast on the 21st of October 2007. However, it's being recorded massively in advance. The reason being, on the 21st of October this year, I will be getting married. In fact, if I can work libs in properly, this podcast will be broadcast at exactly the same moment that I'm giving out my vows. A sort of wedding gift to you, my listeners. Does that sound pompous? Very probably. I suspect actually it is. Anyway, this podcast's going to be all about the Eighth Doctor. Now, the Eighth Doctor, Paul McGann. Does he count? Well, originally, during the exciting run, we finished watching Doctor Who in 1989. We had Virgin novelisations, it all hung around, and we were, dreaming about the blue light still flashing. Virgin Publishing had managed to keep Sylvester McCoy's Doctor going for longer than any other Doctor had been around. There was talk at the time of having him regenerate, but of course that wasn't really on the cards. And then, a co-production between the BBC and the Fox television network in America produced the pilot for a brand new series. Well, that's what we thought it was. We didn't realise that it was in fact just one of those movies of the week that Americans seem so fond of. Sadly, in America, the Paul McGann story was actually broadcast up against, I believe, the episode of Roseanne where Dan dies, or something along those lines. I was never completely fond of the facts, and to be honest, we didn't really care, because we were in England, and we were watching Doctor Who. But of course, although it was shown over the Maybank holiday, we had actually already seen it. And no, this wasn't in the exciting early days of the internet. What happened was the BBC had released the story on VHS. I'd queued up outside HMV, which at the time was just a store dedicated completely to VHS. Ah, bless. It had a tiny section for these newfangled things called DVDs. I queued up like a good little boy, and I paid my money, and I went home and watched it. Now, admittedly, by this time it was getting on for 12:30 when I started watching it, and by the time it finished it was 2 a.m, and I was, to say the least, a little bit disappointed. Part of me was annoyed. Little things like the fact that they said it was shot on film, which it was, but then they'd done all the digital processing using NTFC, which is why the colour coding was all wrong. It didn't look like Doctor Who in that sense. Moments of it were fine. The combination of, oh, who am I kidding? I was just upset when some idiot went half human. Half human? What's all that about? This isn't a review, this has become a rant. Let's look at the review side of things instead. In order to fit in with the Doctor's history, it was thought at the time that a regeneration scene was a good idea. Russell T Davies has learned from this, which is why in the 2005 series we just jumped straight in with a newly regenerated Doctor. Seemed to work. The Doctor was new to us, we were new to him. It was fine. But in order to count for us, it was seen by the production team that we really needed to see a regeneration. Also, it fitted in with the plot quite well. And so we see Sylvester McCoy's last ever story, and he does a fantastic performance. Admittedly, he doesn't say very much, but he still manages to portray a certain doctorness, and of course, he does open with a marvellous time in the TARDIS. Unfortunately, the programme opens with a voiceover explaining far too much backstory for new viewers, just confusing people who aren't familiar with the show. And people who are familiar with the show are sitting there going, well, that Dalek sounds wrong. What's up with the TARDIS? What's this? What's this? And then we all go into a Disney song. Or not. Again, the plot is quite over the top. The Master has been killed by the Daleks, but again, as always, the Master survives, wreaks havoc on board the particularly gorgeous interior of the new TARDIS, although why it has the seal of Rassilon everywhere, like a Made in Hong Kong sticker, I'll never quite know. And then there's a forced temporal landing in the distant future of 1999. Yeah, move on. And, well, the Seventh Doctor leaves the TARDIS, not checking the scanner, gets shot, ends up in hospital, has to regenerate, forgets who he is. In keeping with all of the other regeneration stories, the Master steals the body of an American actor, I believe Julia Roberts' brother. Yeah, the performance was simultaneously camp and not camp enough. Perhaps Americans just can't do pantomime villain. Or perhaps they can, and I just don't want to think about it. There's bags of gold, there's car chases, there's talk of a beryllium clock, there's talk of resetting the TARDIS, there's all sorts. On paper, like many things, it's a great story. But it just didn't quite work, and you were just put off a little bit. I don't know, perhaps that was just me. Why the Eye of Harmony was on board the TARDIS is beyond me, but a link to the Eye of Harmony, let's just let it go. Let it go, it's not important. These things should not let me lose sleep. But they did, and they left a bitter taste in my mouth. Unfortunately, the bitter taste was not taken away by other things. It was not taken away by other episodes because there were no more episodes. That was it. That was our last best hope for Doctor Who. And then the series went away. The BBC regained the rights to the novels, and the Eighth Doctor carried on there, starting off with The Eight Doctors, and so on. The novels became increasingly complicated and increasingly odd, and were eventually largely ignored, except by a very, very select few. However, there was a voice of dissent. Something marvellous had happened. Some people had taken characters from... As the run of Doctor Who books published by Virgin were coming to an end, the Doctor had a new companion, Bernice Summerfield. Bernice's copyright remained that of its creator, a certain Mr. Paul Cannell. Paul Cannell then gave the rights to a small audio company to make some Bernice Summerfield spin-offs. Bernice would live in the extended Doctor Who universe and do wonderful things and have adventures. It was kind of Doctor Who by the back door. Thanks to these, that led in turn to Big Finish being formed, some old Doctors being signed up, and some gaps being filled. Big Finish, however, had other plans. As well as producing stories with the old Doctors, that would be the 5th, 6th and 7th Doctors, filling in gaps in their run, or in Colin Baker's case, an entirely new series, we would have the 8th Doctor return to us. The same actor, in the same TARDIS with the same sound effects, would give us new stories. This would be the return of the 8th Doctor. So, if you just think that televised stories are real, and that things that happen on CD aren't, then stop listening to this review now. If, however, you're interested in the entire run of the 8th Doctor, please keep listening. Are you still there? Right. Paul McGann made a triumphant return on CD. This is audio only, by the way, not a DVD. Don't rush out to try and buy this to watch. You won't find it. Sadly, it hasn't been animated. There's no flash animation to go over the top of this. It's just an audio CD. Have I given people ideas? Stop it. Storm Warning was the very first story. The 8th Doctor ends up on board the R101. As we all know, the history of airships on Earth has never been a particularly wonderful thing. And of course, we all know what happened to it. However, on board the R101, the Doctor meets a stowaway called Charlie Pollard. Charlotte. She is indeed, as she describes herself in interviews, posh totty, as some people describe it. Basically, she's an upper middle class woman who wants a bit of an adventure. She's an Edwardian aviatrix, if you will. She's ran away and she's going to meet some strange man in a distant place. She was hitching a lift and, well, the Doctor rescues her. Sadly, the Doctor should not have rescued her because she was meant to die on the R101. At this point, time fractures. As a first story, Storm Warning works. It works on many, many levels. I would recommend this as a great starting point. It introduces all the characters, and it reintroduces us to the 8th Doctor. And we start to like him a little bit more. Obviously, with all Doctor Who stories, we like to continue with an old villain. And story number 2 is The Sword of Orion. We're going to class this as sort of McGann's first season, if you will. Sword of Orion is episode 2. It consists of a lot of background with the Cybermen on board a derelict ship, some people trying to get on board the derelict ship, but discovering that the commander is in fact not what she seems. It's well worth taking a look at. Well, I say a look at, but you know what I mean. A good listen. Sword of Orion also gives a huge background to the spin-off Cyberman series, which is very good and was available last year from the same production company. It's followed rather sadly by Stones of Venice, not the strongest of McGann's stories. Stones of Venice, like the title says, takes place on Venice as it sinks, finally into the waves. It's almost a pseudo-historical, but obviously it's set in the future. It's kind of forgettable, mainly because it's surrounded by such other strong stories. For example, the story that follows it is Minuet in Hell. Now for me, Minuet in Hell actually has a different origin story, because the company that eventually became Big Finish had been producing small fan-based audios starring each other for some time. Years earlier, Minuet in Hell had been available on cassette and had been recorded and passed around amongst Doctor Who fans for people to listen to. It consisted of a person who was the Doctor in an asylum meeting someone else who thought he was the Doctor with the background of the Hellfire Club. It worked in that particular instance because the people playing the Doctor, you didn't recognise either of their voices. It worked on audio for that reason. However, in this version of the story, the 8th Doctor, who we know and can recognise his voice, meets someone else who claims to be the Doctor, while the 8th Doctor keeps getting facts wrong. Mainly it's a problem to do with psychic transference and the like, but it's still well worth listening, and of course it has the Brigadier in it. Ah yes, good old Alistair. Minuet in Hell, rather oddly, is followed by Mark Gatiss' story Invaders from Mars. The basic premise has been done before. What if Orson Welles' War of the Worlds was in fact true? It's the nearest to a comedy story that McGann has ever really done. It works on several levels, though not all of them. However, something that it is worthy of note because it actually has Simon Pegg in it, as well as quite a good cast of some very good comedians. It's followed by something that works extremely well on audio. The Chimes of Midnight. It was voted a very, very good story. It's very Sapphire and Steel. It takes place in what could or could not be a haunted house. It's where you're beginning to realise that there's something up with Charlie. The odd hint that Charlie's survival had changed and altered and fractured time in a sort of continuing story arc had been dropped in with various mistakes, obviously on purpose, appearing in other stories. There were facts which were not right. Some people hadn't heard of Shakespeare and the like. After Chimes of Midnight, we're presented with Seasons of Fear. Seasons of Fear is an interesting story because it brings back a very, very old villain. But I'd rather not spoil it for you because you'll probably be able to figure it out yourself while listening. The Doctor comes up against a man who is actually older than the Doctor. Well, older than his official age, shall we say. It's reminiscent in many respects of the film Highlander, so I would definitely consider giving that one a go. Again, a next story, which follows, works exceptionally well on audio, because Embrace the Darkness takes place mainly in the dark. It's an old conceit that radio shows take place in the darkness. It allows people to explain things a lot more to the listener, but it works. It really does work. Embrace the Darkness has very, very, very obvious roots in certain other films, but then again, that doesn't necessarily make it a bad thing. And of course, every Doctor needs to meet the Daleks at least once, and Time of the Daleks is a very, very good introduction to that. It does have some dodgy science, but then again, it's the same science that's seen in various Troughton stories, shall we say. The Doctor and Charlie encounter the Daleks, but are rather surprised to discover that they're Shakespeare's biggest fans. Yes, this story kind of counteracts the Shakespeare Code and other references, or does it? We just don't know. I'm sure there are throwaway references and throwaway designs, but basically the problem is the Daleks have interfered with history. They may or may not have kidnapped Shakespeare, and other exciting things like that. The following disc is called NeverLand. This brings to a conclusion the whole Charlie may or may not really have been meant to die, if you see what I mean. It takes place on Gallifrey, it has Lalla Ward in it, and it is particularly good. It finishes with Paul McGann's Doctor and Charlie choosing to leave Gallifrey, and indeed leave our entire universe, to a universe that has no time. They're sucked through and into, we just don't know. And we never found out for a year. That was the gap. That was where they chose to place it. And unfortunately, NeverLand had been such a strong story that when Zagreus finally came to us in its 3-disc majesty, even including John Pertwee, we were presented with an odd tale of the Doctor going slightly mad. But unfortunately, it was only slightly mad. Because when he emerged from the other side, he emerged into an alternative universe without time. And sadly for me, the series began to change slightly. I didn't really enjoy the next few stories, the ones that all seemed to take place. Scherzo, which is where the Doctor and Charlie find themselves in nowhere, which plays on the same conceit that you can't see anything because neither can they, because it's just pure whiteness. All they have is each other, and they wander around holding hands and morphing into each other, and it's all a little bit odd. They keep meeting this odd, strange voice-over insect thing called Bridger, I believe. Yeah, I just didn't really get it. I didn't like it, because then it was followed by Creed of Kromon, which has a new companion called Kriz. Kriz turns up and he is sort of lizard-like. He's an ex-monk with psychotic tendencies that eventually evolve as the stories go by, and on the Doctor tries to find out what's really going on. The Natural History of Fear, I must at this point say, I had a very, very odd experience listening to. You see, what I'd done was, I'd got the CD, and I was listening to it in the car, but I hadn't really been paying attention to the CD on the grounds that I was driving. It's alright, I didn't crash or anything like that, but what I did do was listen to episode 3, 4, and then episodes 1 and 2. Now, listening to episodes 3 and 4 just blew my mind, because I had no idea what was going on. I deliberately hadn't read the box. All I knew was that it had a sort of spinning top on the front, and I had absolutely no idea what was going on. It was the most challenging piece of narrative I've ever experienced, mainly because I had no idea what was going on, because I hadn't actually listened to the first 2 episodes. So, there's a little rule for you there. Always make sure you've put the right disc in, otherwise the plots will make no bloody sense whatsoever. The Twilight Kingdom, again, there's just nonsense happening. Faith Stealer, the Doctor re-examines what it means to be, religion. And then there's the last, again, not great stories. It's something about an atomic war. To be honest, I just let it wash over me. There was something about a planet dying, and I just didn't really get it at this point. This whole season was falling apart for me. Caerdroia was a point where the Doctor actually gets back his TARDIS and confronts the Croaker. By this point, you were just hoping that it would be over quite soon. The reason you think it might be over quite soon is because you know Russell's bringing back the series. You're concerned that if Russell brings back the series, there might not be a join between the 8th Doctor and the 9th Doctor. By this point, of course, we had no idea what was really happening. All we knew is that the Doctor was in this universe, and if you were listening to the CDs, you knew the Doctor was, of course, in another one. You knew he had to get back. So, at the end of The Next Life, the Doctor finally makes it back, and the last few words are Davros saying, "Welcome back, Doctor." Oh, it was lovely hearing it. Unfortunately, that led to the story Terra Firma, which was, of course, discussed in the history of the Daleks. Terra Firma works on a lot of levels. You find out more about the Doctor's past in a good way, and you get to see the Doctor and Charlie all kind of work to defeat the Daleks on Earth. The Daleks keep invading Earth for no real reason. I'd love for them just to ignore the Earth for once. So we're back in the real universe. All bets are back on. Charlie's here. Chris is now living in our universe. We feel better. On TV, time's passing. The Doctor Who novelizations have completely gone off in their own direction. I'm sure I could do a podcast on those, but to be honest, I just don't know enough about them because there's so many. Scaredy Cat feels like the sort of story that could have taken place in this alternative universe. It's a planet that has a sort of memory on board. Again, it's a fairly disposable story, which is a shame because it had some lovely moments. Other Lives, however, actually I feel would make a very nice Big Finish story to be transferred. It deals with the possible outcomes of what happens if our three heroes choose slightly different paths, choose to help people in slightly different ways. It's very, very well done. Time Works again, however, is something, again, that just feels like it could take place in this timeless universe. The Doctor is actually on a planet that has no time. After the rather forgettable episode Something Inside, and to be honest, I'm not even sure I actually bought it, which is odd, because I'm sure I've got a standing order for all of them. We reach Memory Lane. Again, Memory Lane would make a very nice adaptation for the new TV series. The Doctor lands on what looks like a suburban street, but it's a suburban street that goes on forever. We find out that in fact it's a prison, and it contains one person who is an adult trapped in his 8-year-old self's environment. It's quite well done. At this point, things kind of go awry. You see, we've got the Doctor, the 8th Doctor, we've got Chris, and we've got Charlie. Charlie's time in the TARDIS is coming to an end, we know that. But so is Chris's. Now, the reason we know that is because BBC7 have decided to completely revamp the series and bring on a companion called Lucy Miller. We found this out last Christmas in a rather nice run on BBC7 of stories that you could download at the time and then became Big Finish stories. So in order to make this work, we now have to jump to stories that we haven't actually seen yet. We have the story Absolution, which is release number 101, which should be out in the next few months. I'm thinking the end of October. And then release 103, which is The Girl Who Never Was. Now it looks like Conrad Westmaster, who plays Chris, will be leaving in Absolution, so obviously he needs to sort out his issues. And then Charlie will end her almost 10-year run with the 8th Doctor in The Girl Who Never Was. I know very little about that story. I would love to review them, so I will when we come to him. So, after the story, which we won't get until October, we then jump back to the story that we got at Christmas last year, which of course is Blood of the Daleks, Part 1 and Part 2. Again, it's a lovely Dalek story, but this time we've got Sheridan Smith playing the companion. Again, she's feisty, but she's a lot more like Rose, crossed with Donna, than she is like Charlie. Charlie definitely was an entity in herself. The Horror of Glam Rock is a very good story, but then again I'm suspecting you may have heard it. The Doctor and Lucy arrive in 1974 Bernard Cribbins is in the story, and there's a creature outside in the snow. Again, it's what Doctor Who does very well. Small cast, small cut-off environment, there's a creature at the door, what are we to do? Immortal Beloved has a lot of Greek gods and cloning and a lot of science in it, very nicely done. Again, Phobos is a good story, but it didn't grab me as well as I would have liked to be. The denouement is fairly stationary. The denouement is fairly pat, which is quite sad given the build-up. No More Lies is a very nice story which deals with one of the things that I personally don't like in Doctor Who. I don't like time travel stories that deal with time travel. I know that's an odd thing for a time travel TV series, but I'd rather the TARDIS was used to get somewhere and then something happened, rather than time itself was used to solve an issue. And then we come to the end of this new season with Human Resources, Parts 1 and Part 2. This, of course, is another Cyberman story. We've got a first season that's got Cybermen and Daleks. The return to the good old days. We think it's the same sort of design of It appears that it's the same sort of design of Cybermen that we had in the 70s, but of course with it being audio you cannot really tell. It's a well thought out, well executed story, and I would definitely consider this as part of a very good season. So, if you're thinking about taking up the Paul McGann Doctor, you can either start at Blood and the Daleks, which is a very nice introduction point, or you can work your way through the entire Charlie. I must admit, I would probably stick with Charlie. Lucy is a great companion, and she does bring out the best in Paul McGann's performance, but then again I've got a soft spot for Charlie's acting as well. The only thing that I've not mentioned so far is Shada. Shada, if you remember, was a fourth Doctor story that was never truly completed, written by Douglas Adams. Obviously The Hitchhiker's Guide was very big on the radio, so Shada works very, very well on the radio. Basically what they've done is they've taken the 8th Doctor and they've made him travel back in time to find out what happened when he was the 4th Doctor, when he didn't manage to get the Book of Rassilon. I won't really spoil it anymore, but it does have Romana and K9 in the 8th Doctor. It's very funny, very well thought out, very well adapted, and I would definitely suggest picking that one up if you just want a nice standalone story in order to give the 8th Doctor a chance. And let's face it, the guy deserves a chance, because now he does count. He is the 8th Doctor, and for a lot of us, he was one of the Doctors with the longest reign. And that brings us to the end of my reviews of the past Doctors. I'll try and do one of the 9th Doctor, and I'll try and do one of the 2006 season as well. But, of course, as I'm recording this in September, by the time you hear this, Sarah Jane Smith will have had a few episodes. So hopefully, in my next few podcasts, I'll do some reviews of those as well. And now, I have to get back to my wedding. Be seeing you. You've been listening to the Tin Dog Podcast. You can email the show at tin-dog@hotmail.co.uk. Doctor Who and related shows are trademark of the BBC. No infringement is intended.